Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has vowed to make stamping out grooming gangs a major priority, and himself and Home Secretary Suella Braverman have been outlining their plans to tackle the crisis. It goes without saying that there is a unanimous desire to end the sickening sexual abuse of women and girls, but media reaction to the government's plans has been mixed, to say the least. Let's have a look at some of the newspaper's headlines. A Guardian's article says NSPCC warns against framing grooming gangs problem as ethnically based. One of the headlines in The Independent states, grooming gangs don't just come from one ethnic background, Tories warned. There's a number of examples there. In particular, journalists have been critical of Braverman for outlining the prevalence of Pakistani Muslim rape gangs in the UK. Are Braverman's critics getting their facts right? GB News Investigates reporter Charlie Peters has worked tirelessly to raise awareness about the grooming gang crisis, and he joins me now. Charlie, the media have been more critical, I would say, of Suella Braverman than they were of the grooming gangs themselves. Would you say that's fair?
I'm not sure that's particularly fair. I think when the scandal first erupted in 2012, and most of the focus is on this story, I mean, they were pretty visceral. In fact, it's been very interesting to track the reaction from that time, a decade ago, to this policy now in 2023, the reaction in terms of the language used then and the language used now. In fact, many of the people this week who I think have shamefully let themselves down in the language they've used and the accusations of racism that they've made were 10 years ago using the language that Suella Braverman was using on Sunday when she announced her policy. So, but in terms of the reaction to the story on Monday, and if we just focus on this week, then yes, I think there has been more criticism and more fear about the backlash than the actual problem itself.
Well, was it Adil Ray who compared so-called racist reactions to the report to 9/11 and 7/7, for goodness sake? Talk about hyperbole.
Yeah, well, precisely. And this is a classic trope we have where people are more concerned about a fake backlash that they fear rather than the issue itself. They fear more about some perverse form of vigilante justice arising from the shires, which never actually happens, of course, more than they fear dealing with the problem and pointing out that these disparities exist within society. And this week, there's been a huge fuss in the media, I'm sure you've seen, about Matt Goodwin writing this book called Values, Voice and Virtue, talking about these new elites, these new progressives who coalesce around ideas of progressivism and pro-diversity, pro-immigration. And he's argued that these people will hold enormous amounts of cultural power in the arts and in the charity sector and in journalism as well. And when these issues come up, they do coalesce around the left liberal line. And people have been very upset to be included in this bracket. I mean, Goodwin's come out for a lot of criticism for pointing it out. But in the same week that this has happened, we have had a perfect example of this happening. Loads of people within the charity sector, the NSPCC there, for example, the Runnymede Trust, Adil Ray, loads of other commentators and broadcasters, all saying, you can't possibly talk about this problem, it's racist, and dominating the national conversation, while ordinary Britons who are very concerned about these gangs are sidelined. I think Goodwin's point and the national conversation that I'm trying to have to restart this issue, it's been proven straight away.
Well, Suella Braverman herself said it's not racist to tell the truth. But what I want to get to, Charlie, is what is the biggest impact here? Or you've been tracking this. Is it the diversity, inclusion and equality argument that we have to support diversity and actually addressing this issue would be damaging to diversity? Or is it the fear of the so-called far right that I don't think actually exist at the moment, but we should be fearful that they will exist if we keep burying this under the carpet?
I think it's predominantly the former. In the year-long investigation I took into this crisis, we found an example of one man called Maruf Hussain, who was a Labour minister in the Rotherham Council throughout the noughties. He had to resign in 2015. He was the community cohesion minister, and he was accused in the Casey report of deflecting investigations into Pakistani taxi drivers. And he made a false accusation of racism against a Labour member. And he did this, it's alleged, because, and many survivors have told me, he prioritised social cohesion over the security and safety of young women and girls. That one example is replicated in many other places. And Maruf Hussain, we found in January, was still working in the public sector, now as a diversity manager in the NHS. And so these things, the lessons have not been learned. When this huge crisis erupted, there was a rush to defend diversity and the political attachments to progressivism more than there was a keenness to stamp out this problem. And that is why it is still going on today.
Well, I see two problems there. One, that it seems the fear of being accused of racist or being racist or the fear of racism is what's enabled this problem to persist.
Yeah, and there's also been, I think, quite a lot of political attachment to that problem.
Yeah.
I mean, The reaction we've seen very aggressively against Braverman has, of course, predominantly come from the opposition. The Labour Party reacted most vociferously to this. I mean, Tracy Brabham, the West Yorkshire mayor, said it was dog whistle politics. Other commentators on the left have made similar accusations. And I think the political issue here, that the problem that dealing with child abuse has been politicised so much, has meant that it's been very tough for everyone to come together and support an honest and direct approach to dealing with this problem. I mean, I'm very glad that Aaron's here, for example, because when I broke a story in December about the Labour Party selecting a parliamentary candidate who was forced to resign in 2015 from that same report, I think, as I told him this week, Aaron was the only noticeably left-wing commentator who shared that GB News story, because everyone else thought it was, too embarrassing, or they didn't want to be associated with the channel. They have their reasons, I don't know. And that kind of divide has definitely hampered our response to this problem.
Well, thank you for that segue, Charlie. Let's bring Aaron in. Aaron, do you think many people on your side of the political divide are too fearful of being associated with people on the right that they're not addressing this very important matter?
I think that's probably true. I think it's probably true more broadly in politics, and I think it works both ways, by the way. I think there are many people on the right that wouldn't share an article from Navarro Media because, But I think it was exceptionally good journalism, that particular piece, with regards to the councillor there. What I would say, just as a question for you, I suppose, is the left, or people on the left, would make the counter-argument, which is, statistically, certain kinds of child sexual abuse, where they're done in this way, it's more likely to be people from a certain ethnic background. However, the reality of child sexual abuse in this country is, I think, a quarter of people who are victims of it, the perpetrator is a family member. And I think something like 93% of people who are victims, this is the NSPCC, they know the person who's done it. And I suppose the concern is, and it's a shame because we're not having a more sort of structured, informed debate around this, I think some of those people are actually trying to say to you, you're mischaracterising the nature of child sexual abuse, which is often in the home, often perpetrated by individuals, family members, etc. And instead, what we're seeing is a sort of social psychology of this is done by large groups of men who are often from ethnic minorities, which isn't an accurate picture of child sexual abuse. No. So maybe that's what they're saying to you and it's not being communicated clearly?
If they are doing that, they're doing it very disingenuously, because my journalism, my investigation has always been about on-street grooming gangs in particular. I think this is a portion, it is a small portion of child abuse, that's true, but it's a portion that I think has avoided the most scrutiny and successful approaches being implemented by government and regional bodies, the police, local authorities. I think there is a widespread societal shameful failure to deal with child abuse in general. Most of it happens online. The NCA, its specialist officers, they are struggling because they aren't resourced properly. It's an issue we don't deal with in general particularly well. But on that particular point of child sex grooming gangs, that is where there is additional sensitivities and additional resistance to dealing with the problem. And that is what I've been critical of. And I think that the government announcement on Monday was about clamping down on grooming gangs, not clamping down on child abuse. It was about a very specific and targeted form. And people want to widen the debate. They can do that, but we should also make sure we hammer that problem as well.
Emma, we've talked about commentators and journalists and people looking at this problem from the outside, but do you think racism or fear of racism has also been used as a shield by the perpetrators themselves, by the people on the Labour councils, by the taxi driver companies, by people who will use it as a weapon to say, you cannot accuse me of this because you're racist?
I think that if you have sort of certain weaknesses, whether those weaknesses are in law or in culture, there are going to be people who will take the mick. Who will use those sort of weak spots and exploit them in order to do bad things. And actually, it sounds like it's tangential, but I don't think it is. That actually there's a sort of parallel problem to this, which is issues surrounding women and Sharia law and women being discriminated against within Muslim communities. Because when I used to do research on this issue with Muslim women, and almost universally, those Muslim women told me that they felt the government weren't doing anything because they were afraid of being accused of Islamophobia. So I think that this also points to a more general problem, that fear of being called Islamophobic, fear of being called racist, fear of being called transphobic, in all sorts of sensitive areas, are preventing justice from being done. And when we're talking about vulnerable children, when we're talking about women who are stuck within communities that are seriously abusing them and preventing them from having access to their rights, I think that that's a serious injustice. We need people like Charlie to be very, very straightforward and specific in naming the problem, not talking about abstracts, not trying to get out of it by making generalisations and by intentionally missing the point. I think we need people to be courageous, to name things for what they are, and to point out those people who are taking the mick, and to not be afraid to do so.
Yeah. You've got time to answer that if you'd like to, Charlie.
Well, I think I agree. I mean, I want more people doing the same work as me. I mean, I was stunned while conducting my investigation how many of these kind of scoops and scalps I could walk into, because there just weren't other people looking in this space. I mean, a lot of the journalism I've conducted since I started this investigation was pretty entry-level stuff. I mean, people just, have a go. Journos could have done the same thing. Much more of it, though, was about dealing with survivors and having them all, gaining their trust, and that's significantly more delicate. And anyone who does want to do this work has to focus on that. And I think that's a discussion we've missed out on this week by focusing on these false accusations of racism, by starting this culture war fight over the language used. What we should have done instead, spend more time speaking to and listening to survivors who will point out the problem as it is, as they did when they met the Prime Minister and Suella Braverman on Monday, and I spoke to them afterwards, rather than flapping around with this fake, concocted, silly political correctness.